we get a more regular cadence.
All right. I think we are live. What's up, everyone?
Hello.
Welcome back to another episode of What the Future. It's been a while, guys. We've been preparing and reorganizing things and getting things set for continuing to make every episode better and better and better until we have it completely perfected and dialed in. So we got a really good topic for today, talking about network states. Very similar to, nation states, to corporate states, but, in this situation, network states being something that's, I think, have as a foundation that's a bit more decentralized, aligns more around values with people, objectives, goals, technologies like currencies, blockchain, and DAOs, maybe even AI, that kind of play a role into building out these network states. So we're going to dive into what that is today in this episode and kind of explore it a bit more. Give some real world use cases as well, some pros, some cons, and maybe what the future of that can look like. So to kick it off, Sam, should we start with a little bit of history, maybe a little bit of some preemptive knowledge into what puts together a network state?
Yes, and I'm going to be mindful of my tendency to go through the history of all of humanity from the dawn of time. It's my tendency, but when we talked about this episode and thinking about a lot of people in my network, or that would be, learning about this for the first time, I think it's important to share really not a history of statecraft or state building or governance from the dawn of time in humanity, but at least a more modern history of the origins of basically these lines on a map, right? The modern conception of a nation or a country. It's a fairly modern concept. And go from there, right? Because we've experienced a lot of changes over time. I'm looking at this slide now. Is this where we start? Okay, history of modern statecraft. So maps and cartography. Cartography is the term for basically charting, map making technology, or kind of charting whereabouts and recording it. It, I think, really kind of came into like mass production, mass use in the 1400s, though it's been around. We've had maps since the ancient times. People have been recording this. So if we go to what's next, again, as I mentioned, there's sort of this early map in the 1400s called the Martellus World Map. And if we go to the next one, this is really around kind of the 1600s. So 1400s, of course, we're starting to explore. It's the age of exploration. The Vikings are settling new lands, the Europeans, the Chinese, and we're really starting to have an understanding of worlds and empires outside of just a certain area, right? And of course, then we start recording it on maps. But in general, this word statecraft, so the idea of state building, started to come into use around the 1600s or late 1600s out of England. And this is kind of starting to move. If we go to the next slide, which is a map of Europe, we have...
Looking a bit more modern.
Looking a bit more modern. I mean, basically, if you were to Google, for example, like when was a nation state? What was the first example of one? Often France comes up post-French Revolution. Sometimes it's contested to say the English Commonwealth, so 1649. So if you're, the reason I put the map before this, from the 1600s, or the origins of statecraft, is this is kind of coming around to the time of England's empire, essentially. So if we go forward really to nation states, and I didn't include America here, the United States, because we were technically a constitutional republic at the time of the revolution. But really, right, there's kind of this moment in time of revolution, where we're going from empires and kingdoms to the modern nation state, which on the next slide is defined. This is like too much of a history lesson now, but basically, according to Wikipedia, a nation state is a political unit where the state, a centralized political organization, is ruling over a population within a territory. And the nation, a community based on a common identity, are congruent, so aligned. The link here, Brandon, if you click on it, is a pretty cool map that you are able to scroll through throughout time. And the reason I made some slides with maps before this is because this map software doesn't go back in time before really the 1700s, but basically it shows sort of modern statecraft, and you can see the world as it's changed, before World War I, and we have things like the Ottoman Empire that breaks down, and we start separating, or by we, I mean British or French or some of these other countries that were established, start separating areas, let's say in the Middle East. But, it's really, are you able to click it?
Is there a link in particular?
Yeah, it's above it, Atlas. It's just it says overview, and then there's this link on the slide.
Oh, that link. Okay. I have it pulled up on Google Slides. Let me see if I can grab it real quick. All right. I might have to copy it.
I mean, it's pretty cool to look at. It's not really like necessary. It's more something I was just fiddling around with. If people that might give a good example of really like how things are shifting and constantly shifting. So the point here is not necessarily for me to give you an overview of maps or cartography or the specific dates in history from whatever point in the world that we're discussing, but really that if you're to scroll this on the bottom here that you're looking at, I think you can kind of drag and drop to different points in history, and you'll see different areas of the map change and light up. And
ooh, that's cool.
Yeah, I know. I'm sitting here all day like, okay, points in human history. Yeah, you're even able to.
There's the Soviet Union. Okay,
yeah.
Let's go to. Ooh, things are changing. Things are changing.
Ooh, I know. You get.
How back does it go? You know.
I think it was probably like the 1800s or 1700s, which is why I found some other more modern maps. Again, the 1492 Marcellus map is quite famous, and then we had globes that came after that. But again, the point here is not.
Let's go to 1776. Ah, man, doesn't go to 1776.
It is. It's like there's contested history there. Really, again, the point is that this is a fairly modern concept. So nation states really coming into the public discourse as a term. So statecraft as a term in the 1600s, nation states starting to be defined the late 1700s, or the revolutions. It's contested again, late 1600s. And, we had a whole bunch of stuff that happened after that, of course, in more modern global history and world wars and the breakup of empires or the Soviet Union, to get to the point where what we now, if we were to like pull up a map and understand what countries are which today. So again, recent human advance. The next slide we had is this post-war world order. So of course, there's this moment. If you go to the next slide as well, right, where we, in the past, the recent area, we have globalization, so the sharing of information, people, and ideas around the world. And this was, of course, influenced by some technologies from the internet and the information age, from the global financial system. And so very quickly, right, we have these nation states that are like their own little bubbles, and we need to impose some sort of global world order on top of that. So if we go to the next, I can control this. I didn't know that. Hi, I'm going to drive the slides now.
There you go.
I know. Woo. I'm like, this is too much. It's like clicker, click. Right. So this is just an example of the intergovernmental organizations, the current global world order, where we have groups like the United Nations or the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization, etc. Um, in more recent times, there have been a number of discussions, or let's say conspiracies, around this world order, where the role of these particular organizations in terms of their statecraft, or roles in the current world order. But really, this is sort of, again, a recent thing. If you look at most of the founding of the organizations, it was a post-war, post World War II. When I say post-war timing, so again, it's not just that nation states are this era where we have countries, but also the organizations on top of countries that are intergovernmental organizations that also have quite a bit of power, control, influence over things like health systems, over things like the institute, financial systems, global governance, etc. So, do you have anything to say, Brandon, on that part?
No, yeah, you seemed like you're in a train of thought, so I was just letting you.
Yeah.
But no, to add to that, no, it's cool to see, I think, how these governing bodies or collectives, communities, any type of like group thought belief system, has kind of evolved. And it started as something that is very primitive at first, like let's draw a boundary there, and this is ours and that is yours, to actual organizations and things being all over the globe, to what we're about to talk about with corporate states. Like, it seems like over time it's gotten more fluid in terms of how we define this. And obviously we'll get to the idea of a network state here very shortly, but I just think it's cool how that's kind of evolved over time. But it's probably the last 100 years or so, like, that concept has changed with the UN and different bodies there. And then I think now with the age of the internet, that being even more prevalent, that something I don't think most people think about every day.
Yeah. And where it gets complex, again, a fairly recent phenomenon is this concept of a corporate state. So it's not something that I'm totally familiar with any particular who coined it. It was something that even in my graduate school, we were talking about this as being something in the future, because we were seeing the rise of global transnational corporations, or so the rise of social media at the time, the rise of the internet, Web 2.0, where the fear at the time, and obviously this has become a reality, and this is maybe 10, 15 years ago, it's not a long time, that corporations or social media networks would become larger than nation states, or become more powerful than them. So again, this was post 1950s, right? We showed this slide of globalization, the internet era, global connectivity, and all of the business models that sort of enabled global corporations to form. In this case, this is an example, let's just say, of Meta, or in the research when they did this, it was still Facebook, ending in 2020. And I just showed it as a map, right? You're seeing the global reach of that platform. I don't know, I can't read on the bottom how many billion people, 2 point something billion. Often in a lot of the countries that are highlighted, let's say, in the East or in Africa, if you get a mobile device, actually it'll be locked, and the only way to access the internet is through Facebook, similarly to how, let's say, Android device you might be accessing through Google, etc. So right, you're looking at a map, and we just showed you maps of a bunch of countries, all different colors with lines on a map. And then you start to look at a map here and you say, how many daily active users are on some sort of social media platform? And it's a quarter of the world's population, or growing. This is old data. If you look at data more modern, which is notoriously hard to find, by the way, this is not something that most companies really want to share of the share of the engagement around the world that they have. But again, here's another, when it was still Twitter and called Tweets before it was X, but you had heat maps, right, where you could see examples of where narratives or where stories were coming from. And now, of course, our narrative intelligence has gotten better. Really, though, the thing that we're seeing here at this moment in time, it's kind of like the nation state or intergovernmental organizations are clashing with the corporate states. So you're seeing these regulatory battles, especially this is from today, right? Like in Australia, wanting to impose social media bans. In the UK, this is happening. In the US, we're pushing back. But there are tensions in terms of divestment with TikTok, and of course, recent questions around X and the ownership of that platform and governance of it. So, we're at this moment in time where it seems that the corporate state and the nation state model, or the global governance that supports nation states, are at odds, right? It's like, I wouldn't say it can't scale, but there's definitely a tension that has reached a bit of a critical mass. So in parallel, there is this concept that has been forming over, I'd say, much longer than we'll say this was defined. This term network state was coined in 2022. But really the idea of bringing together a decentralized group of people and basically these kind of small, intentionally focused, let's say, startup societies has been happening for as long as the time I just shared this whole narrative of these other examples. But really, this is something that is in line with the emergence of Web 3.0, cryptocurrencies, the concept of decentralization, and so on. So I'll stop there. And Brandon, if you want to chime in on this as well, we can also turn off the slides. Unless we want to keep giving a history lesson, but I think we can just talk for a little bit on this.
No, I'm sure they want to see our faces a little bit too. So, that it's very fascinating again to look at and see how that stuff has kind of evolved to what we have today. Look back, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when I guess coming back to today, see the clashes between government and nation states with companies with social media like TikTok, like Google, these antitrust that, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that was one thing. Today it's a bit different and it's a bit more complex because a lot of these companies are running huge platforms, which are in essence communities with their own exchanges of value and ideas, and where people interact with each other. And that's the basis of what makes a community. And I think it's become more and more complex. Yeah, there's still a company, but it's still, again, gravitating towards what a network state is. And today, there are actual, network states, physically and virtually, thanks a lot to technology. Technologies like blockchain, technologies like AI, being able to have DAOs, being able to have governance, being able to have different forms of arbitration, being able to have different people with completely competing mindsets and views being able to coexist together, either physically or virtually. But to be able to agree because of these technologies, I think is a very fascinating thing. And there's some real life examples of that I think we should definitely share. Some of them being, venture backed, like you mentioned, others being corporate backed. And then there's others that are, again, truly decentralized, and we can weigh out some of those pros and cons, but, kind of give people like an example. There's one in, it's in Latin America. I believe it's in, is it no, it's not Honduras. Excuse me.
Prospera,
where is it?
In Honduras?
Where's Prospera? Is it Honduras?
I think it's Honduras.
I can't remember what country it's in, but Prosperous is a really big one, or Prospera, excuse me. And they're creating a free market society and system where you actually have they actually have their own laws and regulations outside of criminal statute laws with the country. And some of these are unique to the nation states in which they kind of exist in, because you have to kind of coexist within them to a degree. But and I believe it's Honduras. Yeah, Honduras has very interesting laws. They have something called um, ZEDIs for zoning, which allow you to set up within certain zones on certain land, these ideas of things like Prospera, where you can create your own community, you can create your own structure, you can create your own laws, your own regulations. You can kind of think of it like on a smaller scale of what Shenzhen is kind of like, or Singapore has been like, or even Hong Kong in some instances. But on, again, much smaller scale, less state involvement, and the ability to, I think, make whatever kind of law you want, whatever kind of regulation you want, whether it's for business, community, communal values, et cetera. Again, is something that's very fascinating and something I don't think we've really seen before until now. Again, because of a lot of these technologies kind of make, possible today. I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm an anthropologist of technology, but also, people like us are the type of people who like end up living in villages and stuff. So I would say from an anthropological perspective, this is nothing new. People have formed communes and breakout communities and breakout societies since the dawn of people. But I think this recent trend, right, and it, as what you mentioned about being enabled by certain technologies, specifically technologies that were early and continue to prove to be, I would say, experiments in scalable or different models of governance, and moving governance into either algorithms, so in terms of cryptography, right, or decentralized networks, new ways of voting, new ways of democratic processes, both with participants that you know who they are or even anonymous identities. And this really, right, is relatively recent thing. We had the Bitcoin white paper published in 2008, which is, right around the time, it strategically so, as an answer or anticipating the global financial crisis. So this is sort of this breakdown in trust in these current models. And since then, with every protocol, with every network, there have been experiments of groups either aligned around this technological protocol, or values, or a currency that represents values, or a coin that represents certain things, where people have been able to organize in, let's say, virtual communities. Do you have like a dogfight happening? I'd say, like, for everyone listening.
Oh, can you hear it? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's very, very Lord of the Flies as we're talking about it. I mean, so I guess the modern network state before this was coined, for me, this was always being, having been early in this Web3 space before it was even called that, right? Or just Bitcoin. We'll just call it that, like the first. There are a lot of examples of people who came through open source communities or Web3 communities or DAOs, decentralized autonomous organization, for those that don't know this term. The first was an example of a group of people in 2016 that came together. It was a collective for investment purposes on the Ethereum blockchain. Most people, if you've heard of it, you would probably know that it was hacked and it wasn't really a successful experiment and led to a hard fork of that blockchain, raising a lot of questions around governance. But really, this term, decentralized autonomous organization, so people coming together, people that don't even know each other, with a lot of money to do things with it over the internet. Now, of course, we have examples of groups of people, whether we're on Twitter, or now called X, or we're in a Discord server or a video game, where basically these DAOs, or these online communities, shifted into what would be called a physical DAO. So a lot of people are like, hey, we hang out in this video game. What if we all moved to Bali together? Or what if we all moved to the north of Spain? Or what if we all move in? This is sort of where this started, I'd say. So very Burning Man ideological belief system of sort of people wanting to experiment with new ways of living together, new ways of governance in new places. Again, not saying it's very new. I'd say the ones that I was aware of at this time, so we're talking like 2014. I was invited to like buy a farm in New Hampshire at this time with 10 people, right? They're like people like, let's do it, let's build freedom. It still felt a bit like commune-esque to me. So there was still sort of this almost socialist spin on DAOs and physical DAOs. And then there started to be more of them where people actually did live in these places. There were a lot of trial and error experiments with governance. I recall some almost anarchistic groups that like it was complete free for all, complete libertarian, and like everyone got pissed because someone built a tequila hut on the property and things went haywire. Very Lord of the Flies. But really, I would think like 2018, 2017, these groups started really working with actual governments and nation states around the world to kind of figure out from a regulatory perspective how to create what would be, as to your point, something that's almost like a free trade zone that's recognized by the existing state as a pocket for either innovation or community. So it took a spin from just this idealistic, either libertarian, communitarian. I don't know what terms really would describe it. You know, in the past, it felt more like an Israeli kibbutz or something like that.
They have their own nation now, Land.
Yeah. You know, and then it took this turn that would be more of a Silicon Valley startup mentality, right? So either calling it a startup city, or in 2022, Balaji coining it as network state, who's involved, you know, was part of Coinbase, with really a formal, I would say, I hate the word manifesto, but a formal online book, which we could show or just scroll through to show that it exists. It's a real thing. I'd recommend reading it as well if you're interested in these things. I think it's sort of the foundational work, at least, that is putting definitions to everything that we're saying. It's important to note, again, all of this was existing before it was packaged in this way, and it will exist in different ways outside of the term network state. But network state now, as it stands, to me, has a connotation that feels a little bit more aligned with, let's say, capitalistic values or startup values. So really, there is a group of people that comes together with a very specific goal, and often it will be around creating some sort of economy or some sort of business, whether it's focused on often longevity, biomedical research, and experiments there in areas that are a bit more permissive for such things, or idealistic, you know, sustainability initiatives, where the goal of that group will be to like recycle all of the ocean plastic and create some sort of new petrochemical something out of it, you know. So they seem to all have some sort of business case.
Yeah, there's more of like a specialization now when it comes to this idea of community. And I think it's very interesting. And we've seen this in social networks too, with communities and groups and channels. And, you know, I can go to Telegram and I can find a channel for anything. I can go to Facebook groups and I can find a group for anything I like: pets, sports, going to the gym, health and nutrition, memes and entertainment, you know, pop culture. You know, you can find all these things online. They exist everywhere you can imagine across the social landscape. But I think we're going to see more of that stuff, I think, evolve into the real world, into what these network states look like in the future. And I think there's going to be tons of different network states, network cities, and, you know, however you want to frame it. Like they have the line that's being built out in Saudi Arabia, I believe. You're going to see more things pop up that are like Prospera, you know, and the advantage of it is they are very experimental because they're not based on a belief system, more or less, than they are specific values. You look at like the US, it's a very capitalistic society. You look at China, very socialistic society. Any of those citizens in either country, you know, probably happy with their system and their values. But for the people that, are looking out for these things in particular, they're not so much caring about the generalized belief system, but more or less the value. So for example, maybe you want to move to one of these network state communities one of these days. And there's probably hundreds, if not thousands of them, because maybe you don't care what your neighbor thinks. And this is kind of, again, very libertarian. Like, maybe I don't care exactly what Sam thinks and does in her spare time, and she probably doesn't care what I do in my spare time. As long as we agree on maybe we shouldn't have fluoride in our water, and maybe we should, be able to not double book on an airline, having specific values maybe is what the basis of our community is. And that'll attract a very specific subset of people. That's a very specific example.
That's it. That's our founding documents here. No double booking on an airline. Well, welcome to the aviation.
But I think it will get to a point like that, right? I don't think people really care too much about the generalization of values in belief systems. I think we all, have common sense ideals. I think for the most part, we want to live in a society where we believe on things that are hyper important and less on the typical generalized things. And I think that breeds the opportunity for, larger nation states to crumble over time, not like overnight or anything, like they're just going to disappear, but for a lot of smaller communities to really flourish. And maybe you have something that's kind of like united communal-esque, United States-esque, or you have 1,000 nation states under one larger DAO governance system, I think is potentially where society could head. Especially if you think about where, we might be headed in reality, where it could be, out into space and we're venturing around. Maybe we want to set up a colony somewhere on Mars or Titan. Maybe we're spending more of our life in virtual reality and there's a virtual economy. What's going to govern that? Maybe we're living out on the ocean and we're seasteading, right? Like, there's a lot of different ways we could live in the future, maybe even up in the sky and have a cloud city like in Star Wars. With new technology, things become a little bit more limitless. And I think they become more about who do you kind of want to live around, what values do you want to live around, and less, the general vision of society. So I think, that larger, again, to summarize that, the larger nation state eventually will fail. And I think it's more likely we'll have smaller network states all over the place. You can pick the one you want to live in, the one you want to coexist with, and, probably we'll have some kind of AI, DAO, autonomous system that kind of governs all these smaller states. I think humanity will eventually head that direction.
Yeah. So to summarize this, also for listeners who are not from the blockchain or Web3 or even technology space, because we use a lot of terminology here and I'm trying to visualize it, right? We've gone through some maps. So just in terms of the image of these maps, when we have lines on a map, we showed some different shaded in areas, which was the reach of, let's say, social networks or corporations, or let's say recognition of, imagine at this point in the world, globalization, you can go to many, many countries and you're probably going to see the golden arches of McDonald's. That is an example of perhaps what I'm saying in the future, if we started to see little dots on a map start to form around the world. So if the map is not shaded, the map does not have lines on it, it's just sort of a world map. And putting the existing lines aside for a second, we'll probably start to see many more dots, and then networks come out of that. By network, sort of, lines, right? Or almost a neural network. The question is then, how do they start? One, what is their relationship to the existing nation state? Because they will exist for some time while there are still nation states, right? I've been asked that question. This was before it actually became kind of closer to a very scary reality. But 10 years ago, people would say, are you saying there won't be nation states in the future? I would never say something so provocative, though we are now on a provocative podcast. So it's possible that we start to see these little kind of the nexus of new communities form around the world, and they as they are currently relating with existing systems. As you mentioned, they'll probably start to federate or connect to each other, because you can't live in a bubble, even if you're a Mars colony, without some sort of trade, let's say with other colonies
Sure.
or back to Earth. The question is, how do those form, right? Will that be around alignment of you're trading the same products or products that you might need, or, kind of complementary ecosystems, values-based ecosystems? And this really just goes back to almost, I wouldn't say hunter-gatherer into agrarian revolution, but it is almost a technologically catalyzed reset of human social and governance structures, but in the context of having built this previous model of global governance. So it'll be interesting to see this. It's forming in parallel. I hope it's not forming in some sort of antagonistic way, right? Or if there are clashes that arise. I think where they are arising, and this is some of the, I wouldn't say critiques or negative feedback, will usually be centered around from the regulatory perspective. So as mentioned, a lot of these communities tend to be focused on wanting to achieve certain things that otherwise would be in a regulatory gray area, depending on their country of origin, whether this is, again, something related to financial systems, so cryptocurrencies. This was early, which, this group of people, and we both come from this world, so I'm not critiquing it per se. Well, I am, but I'm not, as in a loving way, but it sort of shares in this very libertarian ideology, which lends itself to other values, or is, kind of complementary. So communities, let's say like longevity or biohacking, quite closely knit with more of the, let's say, crypto or tech accelerationist communities. It's all sort of similar. Often, though, these communities can't advance or feel like they can't, because there's so many regulatory safeguards that, or even AI, right? So I think that'll be the first clashes in some of these places, are like, are you doing human experimentation? It is a big question, right? And do we have the right to experiment on ourselves if we want to, like, inject our bodies with something weird and cure cancer? That is a big debate. There are debates also on some people of some perspectives, right, see this as a modern form of tech-driven imperialism, or colonialism, and there are questions around that, right? Kind of groups of people coming in with foreign capital, participating in essentially geo arbitrage, going to a cheaper country, living off of it, maybe not necessarily giving back or respecting the local population. Will there be tensions there? And then also in the current geopolitical world order, where we do have these lines on a map, we have a very real situation, right, where there is still questions of security or hybrid war, or like things that world is still playing out. Which, from my perspective, I almost see this as sort of a strategic benefit. Perhaps in the past, in that world, let's say from a US perspective, might have been putting military all around the world, or military bases in many countries. I kind of I'm like, well, this is just another version of that, more subtle. So it's like, oh, we're not going to send all our people in uniform. We're just going to build a startup city that is building rockets next to you, and not call it that. So, I think those are probably the three areas where there might be some tensions that arise. But it's something in terms of the existence of a nation state, the trend towards it, and the movement of people will continue.
Exactly. While there's so many pros, there's also plenty of cons that can arise out of it. And some of it comes from tension and conflicting ideals and values. I mean, if you live in a community that prides themselves on being vegan, and there's a community right across the river that is a carnivore community, you know, it might be hard for you to stand that. You know, I can see where things can come into conflict and be a bit of an issue. But I mean, if we're thinking from the standpoint of true libertarianism, you focus on yourself, you focus inward on your life, your home, your family, your immediate surroundings, your community, and less on the outside, as long as it doesn't negatively affect you. But that's when the line gets a little bit gray, right? It gets a little bit blurry. And I think there'll be tons of issues with that. And then also within a lot of these network states, I think there'll be issues too. You know, there'll be things around, you know, consensus. Still, if you have a group of 50 people and you want to propose a new idea or a change or a rule, or you want to do something, you know, can you guarantee, because we can't even do that in our own governmental system, come to consensus on an idea, on a vote? It's much harder to do. And then there's also things like power imbalances too. You know, there could be a society that's structured in a way that could favor, you know, a communistic type regime or a dictatorial or fascist type regime. And then you kind of have to deal with, you know, I might have all these values and perks that align with me, but, you know, there's some things that I don't know if I can live with. And then there's other things like you mentioned from, you know, bioengineering, health ethics. I think there's a lot of things that come into play, jurisdictional things too. You know, if you are having a network state within a nation state, like let's say we live in the great state of California and we have a network state, and we have a business that we set up in that network state that doesn't comply with California's laws. You know, how does that stuff come into conflict? Especially if you're doing business within the state of California, but you're based in your network state, whether that's physically located, virtually located, on chain. I think it becomes even more interesting. There's different areas that we'll have to kind of sort through because they're not perfect. And it's one of the few benefits of having a centralized system. And I hate saying that, you know, being someone that kind of lives in the Web3 world, you know, but we'd be lying to ourselves if we didn't say that there are some benefits to a centralized system in society that is a bit more comfortable. So there would be a lot of things, I think some road bumps to definitely go through to make those things come to fruition a bit more.
Yeah. I mean, having either participated in this or even working with some governments, this was pre-pandemic, but 2018, 2019, I was working with the government of Thailand on this. Not so much calling it a network state, but basically saying digital nomads would become a thing. I had no idea that the pandemic would kind of supercharge remote work as quickly as it did, and then lead to people living out of backpacks or whatever, younger people or people who choose to live this lifestyle all around the world, or, you know, move to different countries, with both you and I have done. You are still living outside of the US, and
I never left.
yeah, no, I wouldn't have left. I was actually over there when COVID started. I had to leave at a certain point, or else I was not leaving for 2 years. And but yeah, I mean, we saw that coming. And so the government was working even then on thinking through different visas, or thinking through like their largest real estate company was, or at least the largest landholder via the real estate company, which is also both in there, basically the government was looking how they could leverage different zoning to attract people and, you know, create places for them to live in these communities. So again, I think a number of, even at the level of the nation state or governments, especially ones that are have the ability to move things more quickly because of either a more centralized governance system or something, or they're just a smaller government. We're starting to move towards this. And then, of course, we have the pandemic. We had a bunch of people starting to move all around the world, changes in residency or visa regulations. On the flip side, right, there's then this global tension of let's say, migration, right? At the just different terminology of it, but we're seeing the movement of people, regardless of the reason, is something that has increased. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the governments are aware of it. They're now responding differently. And we'll see these tensions play out. But it's something that, of course, when you're looking at, in the case of going backwards to the corporate nation state model, these exist above the level, I would say, of the nation state or the intergovernmental agencies. They might not like to hear that or hear me say that, but it's the truth, right? It's in terms of if you were just going like to straight up influence of people or straight up human power, man or manpower, but like person power. When you say that like you've got 2 point however or 3 billion daily active users, or let's just call it 2 billion, like making up
Mm-hmm.
numbers here, that's a huge percentage of the world's population. And that is not necessarily bigger than some of the nation states, but I think we're moving into a point where we've seen the power of these platforms. Now, the problem with, let's just use that as an example, a social network, name your network, right? It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this. Even something that has been reclaimed for the purposes of, let's call it free speech, like X with Elon Musk, is still a Web 2 platform. It is still centralized. It's still located in terms of servers are in some sort of place and jurisdiction. People
Mm-hmm.
using it are beholden to wherever that corporation or what jurisdiction they're in. There have been some approaches, right? We're looking into Web3 that decentralize their technology, their software, their servers. So they really are existing kind of outside of any one geographic or physical place. The question
Mm-hmm.
is, can a human being exist outside of a physical jurisdiction? Theoretically, could you not be not exist, right? And there are people who don't exist. They don't have identity or passport or anything, but only exist within the framework of an e-community, um, an electronic community or a decentralized community that then manifests as some sort of physical community, it sounds out there, but I think we're getting to the point where, as we're seeing the shifts in all of our institutions and structures.
Mm-hmm.
And really, what is the role of a nation state at this point? A lot of people would debate on what that is. We're seeing shifts in the US now of kind of Department of Government efficiency, right? Removing more of the administrative state and more of the bureaucracy, I'd say, but it's almost moving towards, again, like this idea of a smaller government. Really, what is that role? And then where all of those responsibilities, where do they go? And does it go to the private sector? Does it go to something like this network state model? Yeah, so it's interesting to me. I like watching all of these. I still just call them experiments, and it's not to trivialize the size of the initiative or the communities or the projects, because some of them are quite substantial, and I have the utmost faith that they will continue growing and have influence. The reason I use experiment is to remind us that we should treat it like an experiment, because anytime that we're forming new models of governance, which is not like some like woohoo, we're gonna do this on a whim and like reinvent a governance system, or like democracy isn't working, so let's try a new thing we just made up with some tokenomics. The beauty of the space is that we've seen now 15 years or more of governance experiments, and some of them are more successful than others. And I guess now we're at the phase where we get to see those experiments move from online communities or Web3 communities really into physical communities. And, there will be some successes for sure. There will be many failures, just like startups, right? You try and try and try. I think the difference is now we're talking about people and living and other aspects. It's not just solving I'm going to copy the Uber for whatever model and create a sharing
Hmm.
economy platform and just do like Uber for dog walking. It's sort of like I'm going to create mini mini constitution 2.0 in Honduras. So it's exciting simultaneously, but it's also something that um, I guess I share it as encouragement from my perspective of treat it like an experiment in a way that we're constantly evolving and tweaking and asking these types of questions.
Yeah, it brings so many different thoughts to mind. One of them in particular is Polymarket. Did you see what happened to their CEO just over the past couple of days?
Yeah, yeah. I I hope that he is okay. I actually we crossed paths long time ago. I'll just say that he worked at my company
Oh,
when
very
he was
cool.
still in high school. Though he was an exceptional human being. There was nothing that he kind of went
Yeah.
on his way. But I think that is an example. I was thinking about it when we were having this conversation of
Mhm.
an example of, let's say, a
Yeah,
network,
same here.
yeah, a platform
It's
that
one of the
is.
first things that popped in my head. I'm like, what a great example of something that's come out of this network state of, I guess, Web3 more broadly, but seeing that clash with nation states, I think we're going to see a lot more of that stuff in the future. Um, and for those that are, listening and watching that aren't familiar, Poly market is a prediction market, and you can bet, you wage your money. It's economically driven, and completely decentralized. Whatever you want, there's tons of different polls. There's just different yes or no, if this or that, type things you can wager on. You can win money. It's kind of like gambling in some ways, but it's the way of bringing people together in a decentralized way to create a prediction style market, and you can kind of bet. And they were doing that for the election cycle, and Poly Market was 100% accurate, not because Polymarket is a company that has some insider knowledge, but because the market, the free market, bet on what they thought was likely to happen. And it turned out to be very true. And, the nation state of America decided that the FBI should take his phone and his electronics and, do an investigation. And it goes to show they don't fully understand what these network states are and what they're creating and what they're doing, and even what Polymarket is. It's not a platform that's supposed to be deceptive or bad or evil in any kind of way. It's the people having a choice to wage, their value on their opinion to create a, a great experiment for a market. Um, I think it's a great idea and something that's come out of a network state, essentially a good example. And then also a good example of how some of that stuff can clash sometimes with a nation state and these differing viewpoints on, how you bring these communal values together. And again, I think we'll see a lot of stuff like that in the future. I don't think that's, a unique incident, unfortunately, but, as Web3 continues to grow, and that's a very big network state, you'll see a lot of that continue to happen. But I just thought it was really interesting, and I think kind of really aligns with what we're discussing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an example of I mean, they're not even operating in the US jurisdiction. They're not allowed to. But yet they're influencing the US, or at least not influencing, but having a role in the public discourse of an election to the point that it was the more accurate as a source of, let's say, truth or indication of the direction of polling. And that's remarkable. It's obviously not something that existing structures are going to be happy about. It would be no different than, let's say, we have existing healthcare structures or institutions or belief systems and all of this, the medical profession, the science, and the academics, and everything that goes into it. Of course, they don't want some, let's say, there's we solve cancer nation state or network state or something like kill cancer. I'm sure that
Sure.
exists. And they're like doing the Fen-Ben protocols or whatever, these ivermectin, like, this crazy stuff. I won't even say, right? Because I don't know. I'm not doing this research, but what's, let's say that happens, right? People go and they're like, okay, we've cured that. And To be honest, when I was down your way, this was a bit in some people in, let's say, Ecuador or Costa Rica. There are quite a few, let's say, retreat communities that had formed into larger, let's say, more of the hippie side of network state. They wouldn't call themselves that. I would call them more like communes. But a lot of them were focused on holistic health and living, and some of them had even claimed, at least to me, and these are very high profile people that you would know their names. I'm not going to name them. That had let's say, a sibling with stage 4 cancer and went to this place and was cured of it. Now, this is, I wouldn't say hearsay, but it's me hearing from a source of very high profile, that I guess I will believe that their sister was cured of stage 4 cancer. But, these exist, right? If anything, they have been around, but just like almost in the shadows, not wanting to be named. It's like, a DAO that can be named is not a DAO. So there's also we're seeing more of them, the network states, come into the light and come into either having financial backing or even branding, which I get a little like icky when I see them. Like, no,
Sure.
no, don't like brand your thing. But it's good, because we do need to move into a phase with some of them that if they are producing research or they're producing new business models or new companies or new approaches, again, in this case of Polymarket, to prediction markets or things like this, we do need to see it. But if there's a fear that of persecution or legal retribution, that's also a problem. And I've already seen, unfortunately, on the longevity movements, which I keep coming back to it, just because if we were to list most of the network states today, a lot of them do have kind of a focus on these values, longevity and biohacking. Right? Like the critics would say for that, your goal is to scale human experimentation. It's incredibly unethical, and so on. The proponents would say, we have the right to do these experiments on our own bodies. And I would say you do, just don't do the experiments on other people without their consent. I mean, we already have experienced that in different models. So again, I think it'll be interesting. The question I ask is, where are these places? And this is something we talked a little bit about from your book. And this wasn't necessarily, you were, I would say, predicting the locations of network states. It was different of
probably right here.
Yeah. You have it. It's right there. Yeah. Do you have it with you? I mean, so it's more, I was interested in the chapter that you had on kind of these different vibrant economies around the world and where we'll see development, which I think there would probably be some sort of correlation between these two things in these locations. Do you remember a few of them? I hope so, because you wrote it.
Yeah, this is obviously I wrote the book. So
I don't know. Sometimes I'm like, did I write this
somewhere?
Yeah.
It's hard because I eventually want my book to be something that maybe is has various versions of it, or editions probably a better word, and then just gets updated over time, because the concept of my book, The Future Economy, is constantly changing as well. As we have new technologies, new developments, possibilities, my book will slowly become less relevant than it was the day it was published. So hopefully with new editions of the book, I can keep up with that. But in regards to like places in the world, that's something that's also going to be changing quite a lot, and has changed quite a lot over the last couple of years, and will continue to evolve. But places like Colombia, where I live, I think most people kind of overlook it, are incredibly opportunistic. If you want to start a business, you want to build out software, right? You want to, be a developer, you find a job. There's a lot of great things happening. You look into Africa, it's one of those continents that's constantly and frequently way overlooked, but they're growing at an exponential rate. largely because of investment from countries like China that are coming in. And, there's an exchange of opportunity there. Southeast Asia, there's particular cities and whatnot. And then stuff like these smaller network states as well, are constantly cropping up. And just to kind of give like some examples, Shenzhen 20 years ago, there was nothing there. It's just a bunch of green rolling hills. Singapore 20, 25 years ago, maybe not that long ago, was just a very poor fishing port. The UAE was a desert. A lot of these places, sometimes in a very short span of time, just a couple decades, maybe less, can turn into some of the most vibrant places in the world. And a lot of the reasons is there's zones in a certain way, they are given their own governing structure, their own, even if it is still largely under their nation state. But there's reasons why Singapore, Shenzhen, Hong Kong, the UAE, like places have done so well and attracted so much wealth. And it's because of the opportunities that are present within those locales. And, I think, in Colombia, Medellin will be one. I think there'll be other places in Latin America where you see that stuff over the next couple decades. Same thing in Africa and Southeast Asia. I think the first world is going through a little bit of a awakening right now, and things are changing, and people are realizing the world is a lot bigger than just living in the US, a lot bigger than just living in Europe. And I think that's very exciting. And I think, again, the technologies we have at our disposal today, with AI, with blockchain, and with DAOs and decentralization, and just the whole concept of Web3 and with automation, I think there's a lot that can be done to create smaller network states. And I really do think over time, nation states will slowly shrink down, and you'll just see tons of micro communities. When you're in high school, here's a perfect example. When you have your lunch tray and you got your chicken nuggets and your milk, you're going to go sit down at a specific table with your specific group of friends and your specific niche. Like maybe you're at the nerdy table because you're a nerd, or maybe you're at the sporty table because you're into sports, or maybe you're here or there. Like everyone has their cliques in society. And the only reason those don't have their own governing bodies is because we don't allow them today, generally in first world societies. But again, I think as that stuff changes, the more of that you'll see, because I think that's what humans tend to do. They gravitate towards, certain people with certain visions and ideals. And so like in my book, I've talked about some of those things a bit more broadly, like some areas of the world that are very opportunistic, places in the world, 20 years ago that didn't even exist, that are bastions of innovation and wealth and economics today. You'll start to see that more and more frequently. And I'm excited to see what the next 20 years looks like, because I bet there'll be a dozen plus more. But yeah, that's a little bit of what's in my book.
I have so many questions for you and just for everyone, for myself. No, I'm also looking at mine because, again, both of us are quite open-minded, right? And I try to stay as unbiased as I can, of course, knowing I have my own bias, but generally just curious, right? So if I ask a question that's provocative, it's not because I believe it, it's just because that's how I think. But okay, so there's one, how are these things just not cults is always what comes to my mind. Like, how does it not devolve into some sort of cult-like thing? Number two, so to your point where we're talking about aligning around values or certain, let's say, cultural archetypes. And I'm not saying this from a perspective of like something on any sort of political spectrum, but like, okay, let's say a bunch of the nerds come together. Do the nerds have women and children in their community? What about old people, right? And I'm not trying to characterize, that stereotype. It was just kind of the easiest. Is it like incel DAO, versus mother and children DAO? And or just longevity nuts who live to be 200. And then there's like, I'm obsessed with coffee, so I'm the coffee plantation DAO, and that's all we're doing. It's sort of like, what happens culturally there? And I guess the answer to answer my own question is like, we have the benefit of the internet now, which we might have not had in the past if we did these things. So there's still enough cross pollination of people and ideas that like we don't end up with these like very homogenous societies. I just say from an idea perspective, ideologically, not necessarily in terms of the diversity of the people per se. That's another discussion. But what comes up a lot when I was thinking through this for my recent book, and I didn't really go into it so much, but I kind of go through every aspect of human society from like the self and individual all the way up through varying operating systems, what I call them, the social operating systems we have, all the way to the cosmos. But on this like community level, one, things tend to break down. So anthropologists have a concept called the Dunbar number, and it was basically 150 people are generally accepted, at least like from anthropologists, to be the number of connections you can maintain in your life. Beyond, like, you know, in terms of having an actual relationship, beyond that, communities tend to break down and need some sort of governance or institutional structures. So I wonder, like, will that apply here? Is there sort of a nice little limit of the size of what a network state will be? Will they try to stay small, or will some grow to be too big? Sort of like how companies are great when you do a startup and you've got like 20 people, 50 people, even 100, you know, but things start to get shady, in my opinion. You know, everyone wants to scale. I think over 150, you need middle management, and that's no good. So, yeah, you know, I wonder about these things of what will be the sizes, and also who is going. I mean, not to say there won't be older people in some of these places. Actually, I did something recently in one of the biggest demographics of not digital nomads, just nomads, are retirement communities. Actually, a huge percentage of people are living on cruise ships, like retiring on a cruise ship. I didn't know this. So is that right? Is that an example? Does that become some sort of retirement network state, that they're seafaring and living on boats and traveling the world in their retirement years? But again, do we see the cross-pollination of different ages or different beliefs, ideological belief systems, or different other differences that we might have as human beings? I don't know. I'm not saying it from a perspective of like, don't do this, we shouldn't do it, but it's more of something that I'm curious about to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be this concept of cross-pollination with different communities, because I mean, like if you put 100 old people on a ship, eventually it'll become the USS Senile, and they probably won't know where they're going anymore. And that's just a reality. You know, things happen to communities when you have a deficiency in things you're going to need in the future. You know, a community of nerds, you know, might be really good at a few subset of things, but they're not probably good at other things. Whereas a community of just women, or a community of sports loving people, or a community of farmers, or a community of engineers, like if you wanted to get hyper specific, and it doesn't mean that a network stake has to be that hyper specific, but if we were at those different lunch tables, you know, it's easier to have some kind of system. Like maybe there's a DAO governing body across numerous different network state communities, right? And maybe that allows you to work in some of those other communities, but not necessarily have to live there or abide by those rules. You know, I think you have to be able to allow them in some kind of way to cross-pollinate, or they will fizzle out and fall apart, or you'll have a lot more contention. Because
you've just invented the DEI DAO. Oh no, it's like,
but maybe properly done, it could work. I don't know, but I feel like there has to be something like that that exists. You know, and you know, manpower, woman power, not to generalize, you know, is very important. The more people you have, the more valuable your community probably is. If you have a community of 100 people, it's easy to be efficient, but it's not easy to last very long. If you have a community of 10,000 people, you can get a lot more done and do a lot more things, and you have a lot more diversity within your community, yet you can still hold on to those smaller communal values. So I don't know what the number is, but at some point you start to lose sight of the communal values of what makes the network state great. And that at a lower number, you just can't maintain it. So somewhere in between a small number and a big number, there's something that's going to work, but we're not going to really know until we actually test that stuff out and let the economics play out.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably something like statehood in the US of the constitutional republic and then coming together in that respect, but maybe more of like a federated network, right? This is more in terms of blockchain governance. And I was always, I would say, passionate about models there that could again, federate, like, connect more, because there needs to be interoperability both of the economic ecosystems or brands, as well as the people and the ideological belief systems as well. And then also, being able to port that back, like a bridge built to the existing system, which I think there's not enough effort there. And that's actually where I spend a lot of my time, my work, not quite literally building software to do this, but now more educating people. I feel like I live, I have my foot in two different worlds. And it would be really nice and easy just to go and build the new world. And I admire everyone who's doing that, right? It's because I'm not doing that full time doesn't mean I wish I couldn't, but there's also a role for needing to build bridges between the existing structures, because they do exist. And it's not something that I am of the belief system that it would be healthy for people on this planet to just kind of pull out the rug and collapse it all and have some sort of like global anarchy, which there are, these are a lot of the, you might find if you're coming into this world, never heard of the term network state before, and start Googling around, start seeing some of the perspectives. There are a lot of perspectives, right? There are plenty that are in favor of it, and there are plenty that are positioning this as some sort of conspiracy against the old system. I think we have the tendency to want to create conspiracy out of everything, and it doesn't have to be that complicated. It could be simply that there are new technologies, new governance models, new ways of doing things, and people are enthusiastic to try that. And they're doing it in parallel to systems that might be synergistic and others that might be in conflict with it. And we'll see it play out. So again, if you're new to this and you start researching, you'll probably see all sorts of things, right? And it's good. It's good to educate yourself on all of the perspectives. I don't personally know how I feel. I would say I'm never actually 100% on many things. I'm quite a skeptic by nature, but I think in terms of, like having lived in I wouldn't say the branded network states, but startup communities, let's call it that, and either co-living while working on a startup or living in a community, or even bringing people together with the potential to buy land and build like a holistic retreat center or fitness center. Like I've done all these things, wanted to do these things. So from that fundamental drive of being a human being who wants to live amongst aligned community, similarly to the United States post-World War II efforts to build suburbs, right? That was sort of planned communities were a new thing, and people, you would hang out with the people down, your neighbors. They'd show up at your door and you'd have whatever, your old fashioned after work, like the guy would come home from home and they'd see each other at church or whatever. We've had this breakdown of community in a lot of the structures that would uphold the community. So this is like, of course, it's a fundamental human impulse to want to do that. And if co-living in larger planned areas, whether it's a city, whether it's a rural environment, I think that's largely a positive thing, right? This is like a something that we've had a massive gaping hole in, like this void of community, and especially local community. So from that perspective, I'm in favor of it. I have questions around if monetizing these things and building them as a startup for profit works, but I'm open to it.
I mean, I don't see why they couldn't be. I mean, you can definitely probably charge for certain things, create some kind of tax system maybe that's more favorable while offering different types of value and perks. I mean, the whole point of why someone would go to a network state style community is because it aligns with what they want to do. Like maybe they're an entrepreneur and they want to experiment in a certain field. Maybe they want to build a cryptocurrency that's tokenizing gold or something crazy like that. That's really hard to do in most nation states because of regulations around gold itself. And it just so happens to sit on a gold mine. Go figure. um, let's say it's something like that. Maybe being in that specific network state, they have the perk of being able to do that without having to worry about it being incredibly costly and all the bureaucracy and the paperwork and them hounding you about how you're maybe destroying the environment, or maybe about how it's destructive to the society's current currency or economic state. Like some of those things would be really nice to have in a small community because you can try it, you can pilot it out, you can prove that it actually works, and then you can broaden it out and take it to a larger nation state or whatever. But a lot of ideas, things like this in society, and this exists in healthcare too, and things we mentioned earlier, just don't get the freedom to try. And because we live in nation states with tons of rules and tons of red tape and overwatch, and I'm not saying that some of those things are necessarily bad. I mean, some of those things are there to protect us, obviously, but at the same time, it's like, where's the freedom to innovate? And so if you're an entrepreneur, you want to build something, create something, try something new. Sometimes a network state is a really good place to do that. And there's a lot of jurisdictions, sandboxes, starting to crop up all over the place, free trade zones where that experimentation can happen more and more.
Yeah, I mean, even speaking from, I don't have like the most expansive knowledge of every US regulation, but I have experience as an entrepreneur, especially one that was involved in across many industries, particularly the supply chains of those industries. And we were working with individuals, companies, joint ventures, whatever, on every possible cool idea of a new Web3 based business model or paradigm. Right. Like if you decentralize pretty much anything. And I remember one project I became quite passionate about, which was connecting local farmers, basically like an online farmers market, peer-to-peer exchange. That was great. FDA didn't really regulate, like that wasn't a problem. But what we found was actually in local communities, there were people basically, let's say people who were cooking, not professional chefs, not professional caterers, but a lot of, let's say, farms or farm stands that would produce their own preserves, or the woman oftentimes would be like cooking prepared meals and giving it to her friends after they had a child, or if someone in the neighborhood was sick. This is a nice thing. So we were like, okay, yeah, we can also go from just the produce on this network. You can exchange your preserves as this online farmers market, or you could make your prepared meals. You have an abundance of extra stuff, and now your neighbor can have it, right? So something that was connecting local community. And this was a no-go. This was super heavily like, oh my goodness, right? Like terrifying in terms of the health system, that people somehow are going to like get poisoned from botulism from their neighbor. And right, like I get it. We need to have certain standards like this, and we can't be like exchanging poisoned water and all of this, though we might be, right? And that's where I had an example of just this really idiotic red tape, that it wasn't even something in some crazy gray area, right? Ethical gray areas or regulatory gray areas, that some of them are a little bit more like, this is obviously something I wouldn't touch. But I'm like, it's freaking, excuse my language, like food. And because of that, the idea gets shot down. It's not possible. And it honestly would have solved a lot of problems, made the local market more efficient, saved problems of food waste, fed the hungry, etc. And it's like, okay, if you're a passionate person, you want to build something, you're an entrepreneur. We've got, I think for any country, innovation and entrepreneurship, both small business or large business, is the lifeblood of a country in an economy. But if countries were so heavily regulating that so that it's impossible to follow a dream or an impulse, even in a test case, and you'll spend the next 5 years and all your legal fees trying to push policy, like a small company cannot all of a sudden like become a lobbyist. Right. So you either have to get really big. So yeah, I'm passionate in this way. Again, for whoever's listening, it's not just these places where the shady characters of society who want to try new and crazy shadow market things. It's it could be something as simple as like a peer-to-peer farm stand. You hear
Yeah,
something like
I've
that.
seen a lot of stuff like farm direct and stuff where, it would be really nice to have access directly to the source. If you're, an everyday individual, it's cheaper, it's probably healthier, it's fresh. You can guarantee its supply chain because it only had one stop, and that was the farm itself. The issue is everything in between. Like there's a whole economy there, and there's bureaucracy, and there's lobbying from other companies have a very large say in that supply chain as well. And it makes it more complicated living in a nation state. Even these companies too, a lot of these, like we mentioned earlier, are their own kind, states in a way, because they have so much influence and so much control and so cut those, it makes it harder to do like some of those things, for example. But yeah,
We lost you or lost.
sorry, I think the connection went bad there for a second. Don't know the last thing you heard, but
The perks of nation states or network states, both of them, the internet. Well, it's exciting. Again, I think I've seen such, let's say, inflammatory language. I mean, pretty much anything you would discuss in our current global and local online cultures seems to be so exaggerated and polarized, and that's just the nature of where we are at this moment in time. So of course this topic is provocative as well on a number of levels, all the way down the line of, again, that this is full on some sort of like conspiracy, and everything in between in terms of the critiques. But overall, I think you can approach it, at least where I find my balance, because I'm someone who've like quite literally lived my life or have in this way or research these things either in person or online communities, that I think if you go from like a fundamental human drive of connection or community or innovation, you can't really squash that, that's going to be there. And I think it's actually something that should be leveraged and facilitated. But it does challenge pretty much every existing system that we've had in place since we started drawing these lines on this map, that we started the conversation, right? we don't need to go through all of human history to talk about all the different governance structures or like feudalism or but anyone who's listening to this, who's alive today as a human being, has participated in the current global order and the current global experiment. Right? Nothing, at least so I believe, like, right, nothing is fixed. Everything is constantly evolving and changing. That is just sort of the laws of physics and nature and biology and everything. We tend to, I think, as collective humanity, get quite fixed in a mindset, fixed in a structure that feels comfortable, that we know how to navigate, that we've built out all these substructures and institutions and laws and protocols. And when it starts to evolve, I think it feels like a threat because there's change, and that's a healthy response. But I don't want to be like, what it's happening anyway. I mean, but it is. I mean, these things. So it's, if anything, I encourage people to learn more, or even, try. Even just connecting to your existing local community. You don't have to like name brand your local community and be like, we've made it the neighborhood network state. But again, I think this fundamental human drive to connect and to create is something that we should take with us, no matter what we call it.
Yeah, throw out the lines, join a community, check out a network state near you. Get the experience, see what it's like. It's not some crazy idea. It's just something new, and I think most people aren't used to in an official sense, but something I think we gravitate towards because I think it does align with how we are as humans and how we gravitate towards people and certain values, certain ideals. So I'm excited to see how that shapes up in the future. I do think it's going to take a very long time for that to be very normalized, but I do think it's going to happen more frequently and more often. And it'll be fun to see how that kind of clashes a little bit with traditional norms and nation states and everything kind of in between. So fun topic today here on What the Future. Definitely let us know what you guys think. If you have any questions or thoughts, put it into the comment section for the video. Would love to interact with you guys and hear your guys' thoughts on the topic as well. If you've seen or heard of or found other network states out there in the world too that maybe we aren't familiar with or that are cropping up, share those as well. But that's it for this episode today. Make sure to give the video a like, comment again, subscribe, follow wherever you like to listen and watch. Sam, any final words from you?
No, other than get out. I mean, don't create a cult or something. That's I have fun with it is all I'd say. Yeah, no cults. They're all going to be cults is the closing term, but I think there are some good ones.
Communities, not cults.
Yes.
All right. See you guys on the next episode. Cheers.